This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovators Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Welcome to Killer Innovations. I'm your host, Phil McKinney. We are back here in the studio. We are getting ready to head into the holidays. As I've mentioned before in the show, we will be at the Consumer Electronics Show again this year with the mobile studio. So if you or you've got a guest that you would recommend who's going to be at CES, would love to hear about it. Just drop me a note over at phil@killerinnovations.com. And we'd love to, have you stop by, check out the mobile studio and catch up. But also if there's a guest or you've got an interesting innovation story you would like to share, we'd love to host you and have you do a segment for the show. So again, CES, which starts January 7th in Las Vegas. Drop me a note at phil@killerinnovations.com. This week, we do have a special guest with us here in the studio, somebody who's been in the innovation game for quite some time. Those of us who've survived all these years trying to win at the innovation game is Amy Radin. Amy has just recently come out with a new book. It's actually not her first book, but this one really talking about the role of innovation, everything from startup all the way up to large enterprises. So Amy and I have kind of a similar kind of an experience of working across the entire spectrum of companies in the innovation game. So Amy, thanks a lot for taking the time to join us here on the show.
Really great to be here, Phil. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Amy, before we get jumping in talking about the book, let's give the listeners a little bit of context about yourself. So, talk a little bit about your background and how you got into the whole innovation game thing and where you're at now.
Sure. So I guess I would divide my career up into 3 chapters. And chapter 1 was really, I was a direct marketing person getting the mail out the door at American Express. And around 2000, this thing called the internet came along and started to get a lot of attention as something that had commercial opportunities. And I guess one of the bigger career insights I've ever had led me to chapter 2 of my career. And that was when I said to myself, I have this background from doing direct marketing in working with large data sets and partnering with technologists to deliver personalized, segmented offers and experiences and product and services. That sounds like it could be pretty relevant to digital. And as a function of having that insight and luck and timing, which always plays a role, I started chapter 2, which involved going to Citigroup and leading the digital transformation of the credit card business, which you have to understand was at its peak a business that generated about $5 billion in earnings and had close to 100 million accounts. So a massive business, but one in which clearly being in a big, highly regulated, publicly traded company, a lot of concern about protecting earnings and not doing anything that would create issues or unpredictability. So over the course of several years, built through testing and learning and experimentation and a lot of influencing and sometimes tough projects, but built a great team and built out the business model for digital for that business, ultimately becoming Citigroup's first chief innovation officer. A couple of years ago, I began chapter 4, which is when I decided to start fresh and leave the corporate world. Seeing what was happening in technology in general, fintech, insurtech, after the financial crisis started to cool off and people started focusing on growth again, I started a new career working largely with startups as an advisor, oftentimes on marketing strategy and how to sell into large enterprises, such as those I work for, and also wrote my book, The Changemakers Playbook, where I really kind of unpacked everything I've learned over my career and also included the perspective of about 50 other corporate innovators, founders, and investors who participated in my research for the book. So that's my story.
So it's interesting because, having been the CTO at HP, trying to be the change maker inside, when I retired, we were 120 billion in revenue, 240,000 employees. And in my book, I refer to all the the people who got in the way, as I say, right? They were the innovation antibodies.
Right.
These are the people who are like, oh, you can't do that. It doesn't, cost too much. We can't, it's not, you're going to risk something else in the business if you do that, those kinds of things. So what was your experience at Citi with regards to how did you get around all the people who probably were throwing those roadblocks or speed bumps through your process?
And certainly there are some days where you feel like you're running the gauntlet.
Yes.
And you want to protect your idea and make sure when it comes out the other end, it's sort of not a shadow of its former self. But I think there's a couple of things at play. First of all, I was a pretty mediocre science student, but I did learn Newton's first law, the law of inertia. And I think that really, we don't like change. And we very much often, as just people, live by that law. And it's, an object will remain in motion and continue on its current path unless it's kind of knocked out of the block by something bigger and tougher. And very often in the business world, that's a crisis. People don't naturally wake up and say, gee, we want to transform or disrupt ourselves. And I think the other issue is these big companies are very much engineered for predictability and continuity. Predictable policies, predictable processes, predictable earnings, predictable everything. And innovation is by definition a discontinuity. So I really came to see, these organizations are full of very talented people committed to doing the right thing. But innovation is just at odds with a lot of how we are as people and how these companies are set up. And so we did a lot of things. I focused first and foremost on just, talent. Just having the strongest, most diverse, most collaborative team that I could get. And we built an incredibly strong, because I am not a technologist, so I want to be clear about that. My own background was very much in marketing, but recognize the importance of building a very strong partnership with our decision science colleagues and also with our risk management organization, because we're a lending business. So we would rise and fall on our ability to underwrite. But through those partnerships and using our direct marketing skills, we had good DNA as a culture around testing and experimentation. Yeah. And so we would develop a hypothesis, see a consumer trend, see something and say, okay, how will digital affect this aspect of our business or our customer experience? And test it through. And we eventually were able to have pretty routine processes around testing and experimentation. And we just kind of drove out the changes. It was hard work.
Yeah, well, it always is, right? Because if it was easy, anybody would do it, right? It's an endurance race, right? Question, though, because you're one of the few people that I've talked to that came from a marketing background to then become a chief innovation officer at a very large global company. What do you think the skill sets, given that perspective, what do you think the skill sets for a chief innovation officer are today or should be today? Because it tends to be, people think of technical, right? They think of somebody being like a CTO, becoming also the chief innovation officer. It always seems to be some kind of a tech spin, but you were very upfront that you're not a technologist.
Right. And that's an interesting question. And, I don't want to sound like a consultant, but it depends. It depends upon how you're defining the role and what you want the chief innovation officer to do. In our case, we had two major functions. One was we set ourselves up a little bit like an early corporate venturing unit, and we brought seed capital to business heads around the world in the Citi ecosystem who recognized that innovation was going to be important to their transformation and their growth, and really put consumer insights at the front of deciding where to place our bets. So as opposed to starting with, gee, we have this cool technology, what can we do with it? We said, gee, we have an insight about an unmet need of a customer group who we want to serve. How can we use technology as an enabler? And then it came down to leadership skills, being able to bring really strong partnerships with the local business heads. And obviously, we were hand in hand with technology.
I think that's an interesting point from the standpoint of 10 people with a technology background, or wherever your background is, you tend to come from that perspective. But you also mentioned early on that it really is around also having a diverse team, correct?
Yeah, because I think the innovation is hard and it's challenging. I think tough problems are more likely to be solved when you have diversity of thought, expertise, perspective, life experience. And we really sought to do that. We had a globally diverse team, and we had a team who had come from all functions come together. And, you set up a culture of collaboration where people want to listen to each other and want to exchange ideas. And that was what enabled us to get some breakthroughs.
Perfect. We're going to take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Amy Radin. We'll talk more about her new book, The Changemakers Playbook, when we come back from this quick commercial break. All of the links and everything we talk about in all of our shows are over at the show notes over at killerinnovations.com, so go check that out. And we'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Killer Innovations. We're continuing our conversations with Amy Radin. The first segment, we got a little bit of background on Amy's background, but I'm more specifically interested, Amy, in talking about your new book, The Changemakers Playbook, How to Seek, Seed, and Scale Innovation in Any Company. And I'm going to jump in right from the title here, because this is a conversation, as you know, amongst everybody in the innovation game and chief innovation officers, is there really that big of a difference between innovation of companies of different size, or are the problems that similar that you can write a single book to cover that full breadth of companies?
Right. That's a great question, Phil. So one of the things that I set out to do in writing the Changemakers Playbook was, I started out saying, well, it's going to be like my catharsis of everything I tried to do in my career, and sometimes was successful as a corporate innovator, and sometimes the obstacles were just too great. And then I thought, well, that won't be very interesting. I really want to go out and talk to other people. And I deliberately chose to interview people across about a dozen sectors and to talk to corporate innovators, startup founders, and investors, because my hypothesis going in was, this issue of being successful as a change maker, functional and technical skill really helps. Clearly, there's an expertise that you need to do this kind of work. But my sense was that it's about a mindset and a wiring and a set of leadership skills, and that how you execute might be different in, the garage startup versus, a Citigroup where I worked. But a lot of the challenges are pretty similar. And it was very interesting to see how much commonality there was across the challenges that both founders and corporate innovators face. But look, the thing is, you think about it, startups, are amazing. They bring speed, a burning passion, and a real sense of purpose around what they want to accomplish. But they may be furiously and passionately barking up the wrong tree. On the other hand, you have big corporates that have scale, brand, infrastructure, tons of resources, but they, don't suffer from an overabundance of agility. So I think to solve the problems inherent in driving ideas from the back of a napkin into markets, real commercial success, the real magic is when you can bring the two together. And you see real successes when corporations partner with startups, when startups are able to bring not just their code, their software, but also their approach and mindset. When they're able to come together, I think that's when you can really get great breakthroughs to happen, particularly in the corporate world where inertia often dominates. They need a kickstart.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like for instance, one of the things we do is we go out and find startup companies who maybe have a product, but they're kind of going down the wrong path. We help steer them, and then we actually introduce them to the big company who doesn't have that agility to make it happen, and we marry the two together in some interesting ways to try to take the mix of both, right? Maybe the idea or the pace and passion from and injecting it inside the large corporate to not to be able to move as fast, et cetera. Do you think one is better than the other? Do you think startups are? Is there a grading scale, I guess, on the ability to innovate that you would apply?
I mean, what I think, having been on sort of both sides of the aisle, as you will, if you will, what I've found, particularly as I work with startups, is that they can really, and this is where I personally bring value, having worked in the corporate world, is that if when you get to the point where you have validated your product and you've said, hey, there's a market and this is feasible and I can actually deliver this, when it comes to, scaling, some of the process and approach to organization structure and managing people and just getting things robust enough for sort of industrial strength, to be able to deliver to a large market, not just friends and family. There's a lot to be learned from the corporate world. On the other hand, when I first went into the startup world back in 2014, it was pretty eye-opening to me to see how quickly and with what back-of-the-envelope fashion you can get certain things done and not have to take, the 12 weeks for a market research study, or not have to do the massive statistical analysis that sometimes back of the envelope would be good enough for the problem you're trying to solve. So I personally have learned a lot from startups about how much more quickly you can do things in a good enough fashion. But oftentimes I bring my experience from the corporate world to startups to help them become much more industrial strength so that they can in fact scale.
So I want to ask you a question about the title of your book. You specifically titled it The Changemaker's Playbook. What is your definition of a change maker?
Yeah, and I went through many titles, so I landed on one.
I could give you horror stories about book titles and publishers.
Book titles and cover designs as well.
Yeah.
So the title, it's interesting. To me, first of all, a change maker, it would be very hard to find one human being who embodies all the qualities of the change maker. So in the end, I really think it's about a team, although that super heroic person is probably out there someplace. But to me, the change maker is somebody who has a belief in a market problem that they can solve and they have a real sense of purpose and such great passion about it that they are able and willing to drive that idea to execution through all of the successes and failures, the moments of glory and frustration, to get from a raw idea through prototyping to driving a business model, winning the capital, and scaling.
Do you think it's an individual, or do you think it's really a nomenclature around defining a small team that's kind of bringing a mix of those skill sets? Because you said no one person has all of those capabilities.
Yeah, I think the change maker, him or herself, is going to have that initial glimmer of a problem that they want to solve for a group of people who are, present in enough numbers to make it feasible, and they will set the vision and have that purpose and passion. But also the leadership to bring together the group of people to start down the path and get it done.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, I did a blog post a number of years ago about what are the right skill sets you need to have on a given team. And what you just described is pretty much exactly, what my experience was of you got to have someone with the glimmer, but in some cases a change maker may not have all of those skill sets, but they know they're self-aware on what they're not good at, and they fill that gap by either getting outside advisors or somebody else who can kind of help coach them through the skill sets or things that they don't have. We're going to take another quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to pick up our conversation with Amy Radin talking about her book, The Changemaker's Playbook. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this quick commercial break. Welcome back to Killer Innovations. We're continuing our conversation with Amy Radin, author of The Changemaker's Playbook, How to Seek, Seed, and Scale Innovation in Any Company. And Amy, I've been sitting here looking at your book. I'll admit I haven't got completely through the book, but I've read a good part of it. By the way, I love the culture section, one of my favorite sections of the book. But I wanted to ask you specifically about this concept of seek, seed, and scale. Can you give us just kind of a quick umbrella of what you mean by that?
Sure. Well, as we already talked about, Phil, innovation is tough and it's complex. And so in writing the book, I wanted to be able to lay it out in a framework that was accessible and practical. I didn't want to write a theoretical or academic book. And so I came up with this notion really from all the conversations I had with the 50 experts of seek, seed, and scale that, again, I call it a framework, not a process, because innovation is not really linear. You could go back and forward. You could spin your wheels a little bit. You don't know if things are going to take, days, weeks, months, or even years. But having a framework gives you the opportunity to say, look, I need to cover these bases in order to increase the odds of having success with my innovation. So just to comment on a few key parts of it, seeking is very much about once you've got the notion of the idea that you want to pursue, being very focused on insights from potential users. What is it? What are their needs? And not because you ask them, what do you need or what do you think of my idea, but because you really get into their space, kind of get into their lives and understand a lot through their behavior, more through what they tell you. What are the problems that they're struggling with? And what are the ways in which you can help them? So seeking is very much about getting user insight by going into their environment, kind of using the tools that ethnographers use. But there's a lot you can do on your own. Seeding is very much about saying, okay, I want to really validate my concept. So it's about prototyping. It's about connecting user insights to your business model. Because a lot of feasibility, it's not just, I think just about anything is technologically feasible these days, but it's the feasibility around can you deliver and can you develop an economic model that's going to make sense and create whatever the returns are that your investors are going to demand. Then scaling begins with this notion in the framework that I call the green light moment. And I think this is an area where founders and even corporate teams sometimes struggle. You validated what you have has potential, and now you want to scale. But you've got to, or it's really smart to just take a check on, okay, what got me here may not get me there. So do I have the full complement of skill sets? Do I have the team structure? Do I have the processes? Do I have the data security? Do I have the support that I need to go from maybe hundreds or a few thousand users to now tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions? And so stopping at that green light moment before you jump into scale is really critical. You may not be the right leader to take it out. You may be great at the seeking and seeding, but you may not be the scale person. So the green light moment kind of forces you to ask those questions.
Well, it's interesting because I've seen it many times over my career that the person, which you would call the seeker, may not have even just the ability to convince people to fund, to go to the seeding part to actually get some of the early pieces of work done. But I find that innovators have a hard time letting go. They kind of get emotionally and personally wrapped up in the idea. Have you seen this?
Oh, absolutely. And I think some people, there's lots of examples in history of the leader who steps away and says, is self-aware and accepting of the fact that they may just be the seeker and the seeder, but they're not so interested in running the big machine. And then you do have, I'm actually working with a founder right now who, on the one hand, does not want to run the business. On the other hand, does not want to let go. Yeah. And I think that, ultimately can have consequences for the future of the business, because your heart has to be in whatever it is you're doing today to grow a business. We're in a world where there's so much change, there's so much ambiguity, there's so much unpredictability. No matter what you're doing, you're going to be in a business that's going to have to innovate. And so having the flexibility and the adaptability to know when you need to change your own role is just super important.
Yep. And in fact, one of the best examples of somebody that I know personally would be Steve Wozniak. He was there for the early days of Apple, but Steve will be the first one to tell you that, when it crossed over into the Macintosh, that was not, he's pulled the ripcord and said that's not what he wanted to do. And again, it helps with people being self-aware on what they're good at, what they're not good at, but knowing that you need seekers, you need people who can seed, and you need people who can scale, and it may not all be the same person. Quick,
it's what you're good at, and also what are you happiest doing.
Exactly.
And I think acknowledging that, sometimes it's hard to acknowledge if you've been at the top of something. It's sometimes it's very hard to say, hey, you know what, I got here, but I'd rather be someplace else.
So real quick, I want to ask you, you've interviewed 50 experts. What is that one or two pieces of advice that you would give our listeners? I mean, you've talked to 50 experts. I'm trying to maybe asking you a really tough question to kind of boil the whole book down into kind of one, two, maybe three things real quick on pieces of advice for the listener based on your discussions with all these people.
Yeah. I think, and also from my own experience, because I've been at this game for a long time, I think the importance of really listening is so key. When we have an idea, our impulse is we want to sell it. We want to tell other people about it. We want to convince them that we're right? But I think listening, starting with your users, and listening with all your senses, eyes and ears, not just ears, but listening to the user so you understand what their needs are. Listening to the people who you have to influence to help you. Going back to some of the challenges of innovating in the corporate world, we focus a lot on selling our ideas, but sometimes listening to understand our colleagues' concerns and where they see risk, and focusing on helping them feel you can mitigate that the downside isn't as bad as they say it is. That comes from listening. And then in the other thing is listening to people's emotional reactions. So in validating a market need or the financial potential, we put a lot of confidence in spreadsheets and numbers, but my very first innovation mentor, a guy who I worked with years ago in banking, used to say, you want to look for the emotional reaction. And when you show people your prototype, if they break into a smile or they jump out of their seats or they become really engaged, that emotional and sometimes physical reaction is a lot more telling and predictive than reams and reams of statistical analysis. So if there's one thing we do, 360 listening is going to help change makers be more successful.
Perfect, Amy. Hey, if listeners want to keep track of what you're up to, what's the best place for them to find out and follow along?
Right. Well, first of all, I'd love it if people would pick up a copy of my book, The Changemakers Playbook. You can also go to my website, amyradin.com, amyradin.com/book. And at the site, you'll find you can download a free excerpt of the introduction in chapter 1 of the book, so you get a taste of what it's all about. There's also a free download of the Seed Scale infographic framework. And you can sign up for my free monthly e-newsletter, which I promise does not try to sell you anything. It's always content and ideas to help change makers be more effective.
Perfect. And we'll have all those links over in the show notes over at killerinnovations.com. And again, Amy, thanks a lot for joining us on today's show. Listeners, don't go anywhere. We've got segment 4 coming up, which is 5 minutes to new ideas. We have a new question that we're going to be posing today, something to help spark for you possibly a new idea that you can take forward, both either to start a company or to apply to your own business that you're currently in today. So don't go anywhere. We've got the segment 4 coming up. And don't forget, we will be at CES. So if you've got guest suggestions, drop me a note over at phil@killerinnovations.com. And we're going to be right back after this quick commercial break. You're listening to Killer Innovations on the BizTalk Radio Network. Back in the early days of this show, I would share what I called a killer question in each episode. These questions were designed to be used in your personal, team, or organization's innovation efforts. Now, based on feedback from listeners just like you, we've decided to bring it back with some improvements. Each episode of the Killer Innovations has a segment that I'm now calling 5 Minutes to New Ideas. It's designed for the creative mind looking for that next great idea. Each episode will challenge you to think differently about yourself, your business, and your products and services by asking unique, funny, and sometimes crazy questions. These questions are designed to force you to look beyond the obvious and to uncover ideas and opportunities you never before considered. So, get out your notebook and be ready to uncover that game-changing idea. Here is 5 Minutes to New Ideas. Every hot trend reaches a point I like to call the Uncle Larry moment. You know what I mean. It's that juncture where one of your older relatives announces he has taken up something that had seemed cutting edge or futuristic and exciting up till that moment. It's that moment when your secret area to hang out has been discovered and now everyone is crowding in. Facebook and Twitter have long passed their Uncle Larry moment. MySpace passed the Uncle Larry moment a long, long time ago. If you've embraced social media, fantastic. If you've been using the same social media approaches to reach your customers for the last few years, then you're falling behind. It's critical to constantly consider and, if necessary, change the way you are communicating with your customers. Do you truly, and I mean do you truly understand how you are finding and communicating with your customers? Or more importantly, do you have a clear understanding on how your customers are finding you? Are you applying an old world mentality to a new world technology? Don't rely on today's version of social media. You need to be constantly asking yourself what form tomorrow's Twitter will take. What will the next generation of Twitter? What will be the next generation of Facebook? What will be the next generation of Instagram? Will you be able to recognize and embrace it in a timely fashion? It's critical to be on board with these social evolutions as they happen and not be the last person to the party. Don't be Uncle Larry. Again, the only way to really gauge which company will be the next hot social platform and which will quickly disappear is to find out what the people around you are actually using. Going back a few years ago, I knew Groupon was going to be a success when I heard my wife, who is not into technology, mention Groupon to 3 different friends within a 24-hour period. She became a vocal fan and recruiter of others to try the service. Now, I'm not a big shopper, and I don't have the interest in doing big comparison shopping for anything other than big ticket purchases. But she does, and Groupon has worked for her. But things do change, and my wife has moved on from Groupon to other similar sites offering deals and discounts. How are you going to communicate with your customers as the nature of the methods you use to interact with them changes? How do you keep track of your customers as they move across social platforms? Years ago, I heard a lot about companies reaching out to their customers through blogs. Now it's apps. Everyone thinks that they have to offer their customer an app for their phone. It will somehow create loyalty, generate business, and basically do the heavy lifting of communicating with their clientele. This is the worst kind of backward thinking. Sure, there are some great apps out there, but who wants 100 different corporate apps on their smartphone? If you're going to use social media to engage with a customer, and by now it really shouldn't be an if, then you have to be early adopter. It's that just not going to happen within your corporate structure, then at least do not be a follower. Or here's a suggestion, hire somebody who is an early adopter and have them help guide you through the maze of what that next new platform is. And if you don't want to hire somebody, just talk to your kids. Don't watch to see what's working for other people and then just try to copy it. Don't be the last corporation to get a Twitter account or ask people to like them on Facebook. You have to take risks and decide what the next thing for you is going to be. And do not be afraid to experiment and possibly fail. You can do zero to low cost experimentation on any social platform out there to see what works for you. But you have to be willing to experiment. It's all about innovating everything you do. So ask yourself, how will you identify and locate customers in 5 years? Now, in order to discover the answer to this, you'll need to understand, where are your customers going to spend their time in the next 5 years? What is going to be that important thing that's going to command their attention? What's that new media, that new on-site site that's competing for that time of attention in 5 years? And how will you communicate with your customers in those new types of social spaces? Do not be satisfied by asking these questions once and think you're done. This is one of those questions that you need to never stop asking. If you stop asking this question, then your customers and your competitors are going to leave you behind. I'm Phil McKinney, and thanks for listening. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join in. If you have any comments or suggestions, drop me a note over at phil@killerinnovations.com. Now, the reason I've been doing this show since 2005 is to pay back my early mentor by paying it forward. My first mentor, Bob Davis, invested an immense amount of time in training and coaching me, which had a major impact on my career. When I went back and asked him how I could pay him back, he just laughed and said I couldn't. I had to pay it forward. If I could ask for a favor, could you help me pay it forward? How? 1, give us a rating wherever you get your podcasts, as that helps spread the word. And 2, by telling others about the show. This episode of Killer Innovations was produced by the Innovators Network. You can find the show notes and the entire show catalog over at killerinnovations.com. I'll talk to you next week. In the meantime, go out and change the world with your killer innovation. Bye-bye.